Happy Friday afternoon. It is 2:30. It is May 12th. This is All Things Advocacy with AARP North Dakota. Josh Askvig, Janelle Mose. We're there. Like
we've been there for a couple
weeks. It's just taken us that long to kind of like plug back in and recharge as part of it. So thank you for joining us today and looking forward to the discussion. We were talking about this a little bit before we're getting going, but it's kind of been a whirlwind. Well, the session ended 2 weeks ago, and we're going to dive into that in just a little bit. It's kind of been a whirlwind to kind of dig back and figure out, remember, tell ourselves even what really happened. But anything else? You happy to be done? Happy?
Yeah, it's weird though. I mean, you spend almost 4.5 months at the Capitol, and you're running and shifting gears so quickly. It's really hard when you come down, to readjust and try to figure out what else you do on a day-to-day basis. But it's been good. But it did take a while to sift through exactly what did happen, knowing that the governor just signed the last of the bills 2 days ago.
Yeah, well, I think what Janelle's trying to say is her colleagues still look at her funny when she walks into the office on Tuesday mornings because they're wondering what she's doing here. But no, so this afternoon, this one's going to be a little bit longer. So if you're watching us live, just know we're going to go a little bit long. And if you're watching this recording, know it'll be a little bit longer than we normally did. Our plan for today is to really kind of wrap up the session and really kind of talk about what impacts happened and what impacting older adults happened during the North Dakota legislative session as part of it. And so I think the best place to start is to kind of just do high-level overview. And I think Marnie's got a slide or two that we're going to show as part of it. So give us kind of just the nuts and bolts of this is what happened, overall, big picture stuff.
Yeah, I always like to dig through those high-level stats, and I think it's interesting. But, as everyone knows, the legislature is limited to 80 days. They did make it to 75 days. They ended up adjourning at like 3 a.m. on a Saturday, early Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm.
April 30th. So, I mean, it wasn't the longest session by far, and they still managed to save a few days, and they might likely have to use those days. But not a record number of bills, but there were 86 bills that were introduced. They approved 583, and the numbers were kind of, not finalized and just until the last couple of days. But the governor always has a couple weeks after the session to sign the remaining bills. So those numbers will change a little bit, but we know that, quite a few new laws were passed. The governor did veto 7 bills, and that's on par to other legislative sessions. Yep. They did override a couple of the vetoes, and then, a really big budget, not strange to many of you, but our budget has continually grown for several legislative sessions, but $19.6 billion over the next 2 years will be spent in the state's budgets.
Yeah, and that $19.6 billion also includes federal funds. So
correct.
Like when we talk about Medicaid funding, half of the Medicaid budget is federal dollars, half of it is state tax dollars as well, but that's a lot of money. So let's do the other high level thing, in which remind folks, when we went into this legislative session heading in, we've been talking about these 4 things since probably October of last year. So this is probably not new, but let's just remind folks, what were the 4 priority areas that we were working on this session?
Number 1, protecting, public employees' pension plans. We want to make sure that people are secure in their retirement. That was one of the big priorities we looked at. Lowering prescription drugs. Obviously, that was number 1 for us. Not just for us, but for members and really everyone in North Dakota says medicine's too expensive. Right. The other thing was increasing access to home and community-based services. So that's kind of twofold. Mm-hmm. So how can we provide support so you can stay in your home or your community longer as you age? But also, what are ways that the state could look at property taxes and how that relates to you staying in your home. And the last one was about consumer fraud protections. That's the number 2 thing we hear a lot about, folks, the scams and frauds that you're subjected to every day. What can we do to kind of tighten those laws?
So we're going to go issue by issue, but if Marty, put that back up for 1 second, just as a reminder. So we had 4 priority areas, and if we just look big picture over those 4 priority areas, and again, we're going to go into the details, so stay with us. But for those that just want to know the high level, so we did not make progress. In fact, probably some backward steps on the retirement security or the protecting employee retirement system pension benefits. We'll talk about that in a second. But the other 3 areas, lowering prescription drug costs increasing access to home and community-based services, and helping prevent consumer fraud and exploitation, as we'll highlight in just a moment. Significant progress in all three of those areas this session, which, considering 33% of the legislature is brand new, 75% of the legislative leadership was brand new, new lieutenant governor overseeing proceedings, that is phenomenal success. I don't know that there are a lot of other organizations in the state of North Dakota that probably had that type of legislative success when you look at it on a macro scale like that. So.
Well, and the other thing is that in terms of why we select those priorities, you know, if you look at 986 bills introduced over that, I mean, it can be distracting. I mean, you could be pulled into a lot of different conversations, but by having those four really pillars of what our focus is, it helps us stay focused. It helps us tell people, yes, that's important, but this is where our, you know, time and energy is going to be spent. And, you know, we probably tracked 150 to 200
Easily.
Bills. So, you know, they might not have all completely related to those four pillars, but they were things that we wanted to make sure there would be potentially no negative impact to older North Dakotans, or else there could be a positive impact that we just didn't anticipate. So
yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Marnie. Let's just jump into it then, and let's start with the area where we probably saw the least success, in fact, no success. And that is, we did wade into this discussion on protecting public employee retirement pension benefits, and we came at it, as you aptly described, from the standpoint of protecting retirement security. We don't believe in tearing down retirement security just because everybody doesn't have access to it. We should be finding ways to improve everybody's retirement security. And so there were really two bills that we worked on this session, one that was really good that we hope to see, and the other one not so good. So let's start with the good first, and even that ended up being not so good in the end as part of it. But 2239, remind folks what that was and where it ended up. So.
Yeah, that was a bill introduced by Senator Sean Cleary and Senator Dick Dever from both of the Bismarck area senators. Really were vested in how do we make sure that the state keeps their defined benefit plan or the pension plan. You know, it made it successfully through the Senate. You know, there was a lot of good traction, a lot of good conversation about both and, right? Like we want to make sure that we fund our obligations, make sure that that pension plan is there. But we also, that bill also allowed for new employees to self-select. If they chose, they didn't want the pension plan, they could have done a standard 401k plan or a defined contribution. But ultimately, it did make it over into the, you know, other chamber, into the House. And we had a hearing, and then we just kind of sat and waited, right? You know, and that happens to a lot of bills. When there's competing ideas in the Senate and the House, sometimes committees will have their hearings, and then this one, it was a month later that there was finally action taken on it. And ultimately the bill did fail. I think it was part of the dialogue throughout the entire session as an alternative. It had started to gain traction, but ultimately it didn't pass.
Well, and it didn't pass because of the other bill that we're going to talk about, which is House Bill 1040. For those of you who may not have watched all of the All Things Advocacies, you can go back and watch them all if you want to track the ups and downs of the session and see. You can probably recognize it on Janelle and I's faces, whether it was a good week or a bad week that week. And Marnie's nodding her head behind the camera for us. But let's talk about 1040. 1040, I think, has the potential to have an impact on older adults and an impact we don't like as part of it. But let's describe what 1040 does first, specifically.
You know, so 1040 was a bill that started really 2.5, almost 3 years ago. It was a conversation right at the end of last session where they said the state needs to study this issue. They can no longer continue to move down that path to have a pension plan. It's costing the state too much. And so 1040 was the result of a study resolution. They studied it during the interim. Chairman Mike before, and then he turned into the House Majority Leader. This was really his really where he stuck his flag in. This was an important issue to him. He really carried it through the entire time. But what 1040 ultimately does is it closes that defined benefit plan or the pension plan for new employees. So new employees now will be routed into what's now a traditional 401k plan or a defined contribution plan. And there was a lot of discussion about why should we do that? And our concern was, that's fine if you want to do that, but what about people that are currently retired, currently vested, or nearing retirement? What are you going to do about that? How are you going to continue to maintain that obligation, and how are you going to pay for that? That's where we kind of inserted ourselves into the conversation, which was different than our colleagues that we worked with on this issue. So we were complementing really their concerns about the overall shift. But that's where it did ultimately, the House overwhelmingly passed it because it had been studied. It was, ushered through the committee, moved over into the Senate, and, the same conversation was happening in the Senate. But, there were a lot of, starts and stops on that bill. There were amendments that came forward. There was, they had closed the hearing. We'd gotten a recommendation we wanted on it, but then it was opened back up. So there were so many different pathways that bill took, but ultimately the committee recommended, they had no recommendation, but it passed on the Senate floor. The Appropriations Committee considered it. So it was one of the very, few last bills that were passed, but 1040 did pass in the Senate, and the House agreed to the changes, the minor changes the Senate made, and the governor signed it. So what we're seeing is, and we don't really know the true impact of this, because now that they've decided to put this bill forward, we're going to have to really dig in, and they'll ultimately know in October how much is this actually going to cost.
Yeah, and I think a highlight of the concern about what is going to be the impact is at the very last minute, one of the amendments to one of the final bills was it's supposed to start next year in terms of the defined contribution, and the concern about doing that is so much so that they gave the PERS board the ability to delay implementation for a year if they don't think it can get done. So this is an issue that won't go away. We'll be engaged in the interim, but let's move on, because everything else is good news for older adults in what's happening. And I think the next issue that we should jump into is our work on prescription drug costs. And I think this to me is a perfect example of the impact that you all who weighed in, who sent emails, who came to Advocacy Day, who talked to your legislators back home, who shared a story, and did those conversations where that cumulative effect, I know you watch a lot of football, I watch football, where they talk about, those 1 and 2 yard runs in the first quarter and second quarter turn into 4 to 5 yard runs in the third quarter and turn to 7 to 8 yard runs in the fourth quarter. And that I think this issue is an example of that, because we're going to start with the bill that really didn't go anywhere, but I think it really laid the groundwork for what ultimately got done. And so let's talk about the Senate Bill 2031, which was the prescription drug pilot program.
Yeah, and again, that was studied during the interim, and we worked really closely with Representative Lisa Meyer from here in Bismarck. She really took that bill and owned it. I mean, it was an issue she really found to be very important, not just to her constituents, but really statewide. She saw the impact of it, and it would have allowed the state to work. Again, it was a model pilot project within the PERS system. We were going to look at the top 25 drugs to see how much those cost and comparing those prices to Canada. So really it was it wasn't looking at importing actual drugs from Canada. We were looking at importing those prices, saying, hey, if I can get this in Canada, why should the state pay more for what it is offered in Canada? We started out really strong. We had some good momentum. We had some billboards greeting legislators as they came into Bismarck at the Capitol, which I got a lot of comments on when the session first started. We had a table tents, really, we had so much momentum behind this. And we knew we had an uphill battle. I mean, you and I talked about it over and over. We knew this was going to be a hard sell, but we went in and the other thing we had was, over 300 petitions that were signed by viewers like you. And I remember, I still see Kathy Schwann, our volunteer state president, holding that up in front of the committee.
One of my favorite photos of the session.
It was a powerful image that she said, look at this. This isn't just me. She held up the petitions that were signed, and it was really powerful. Committee hearing went well, and they kind of sat on the bill for a little bit. It didn't get a favorable recommendation, and ultimately, if we would have had a couple more days, I think we could have gotten a few more votes. But it didn't. We had offered some amendments to make it a little bit more tenable to the committee, to say, well, if you're concerned about, Canadian prices, we did offer an alternative. Ultimately, it wasn't successful. I think that's what's interesting that some folks don't see. Once the committee hearing's over, that's just the committee hearing. All the other work that happens between when the committee hears the bill and then when they work on the bill. There were amendments offered and discussions that were happening behind the scenes, but it did fail in the Senate ultimately. So.
Yeah, but again, I think, I know of at least one legislator, and I think other conversations of a legislator who voted against the bill, who then was asking us, well, what else is there that could possibly support prescription drugs? And that's when I think we knew there was still an opportunity to get something done this session. We had put a lot of weight and effort into 2031 as part of it, but we quickly, and it's not like we hadn't already waded in on this issue.
No.
We had waded in on the issue that we pivoted to that ultimately ended up getting its way through the session, and that was Senate Bill 2041. So we just had to go 10 more bills down the 2140.
It's
That's
a
right.
typo.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's a typo on my notes over here. Senate Bill 2140. Excuse me. But remind folks what Senate Bill 2140 is and will do.
That will forever be known as, what did Senator Dever call it? An old friend.
An old friend.
It's an old friend. It was an Insulin Cap bill. It had been introduced in several other legislative sessions. And like you said, we did weigh into that. And how we weighed into conversations about insulin caps is, yes, this is one solution, but we were looking for broader reforms. But I think because we had already been part of the conversation, not just this session, but last session, we weighed in on it as well. But, 2140, is looking at capping insulin costs, out-of-pocket costs, $25, again, just for the PERS program right now. But you and I talked about this throughout the session. We don't remember in the time that we've done policy work where there's been language included in the bill that really directs PERS now. Requires them to study the impact of how the insulin cap will impact PERS members, and then introduce a bill next legislative session to make it available to the broader, insurance market. So that's pretty significant. I've never seen that happen. So
no, very big. And just a reminder, there's a rule in the legislature that technically the insulin cap is what's known as an insurance mandate. And so there's a rule that any insurance mandate with limited exceptions have to be applied to the state public employee health plan before being applied to the broader insurance market. So it does follow those general rules, as frustrating as that is, and as much as we would have liked them to expand it to the broader market right away and match what's happening on the federal level, or actually this would be even a little better than what's happening on the federal level with Medicare. But I think that's a big win and a big important step forward. As part of it, I ran into a legislator. I've been in Fargo most of this week for work and ran into a legislator who I just went over to say hello, and then he said, we need to talk about prescription drug prices. I know we did some stuff, but we need to talk about what else we can do. And so this is our way of saying, yeah, we've had significant progress. This discussion will continue and needs to continue, and we need you all to continue to tell your stories, weigh in. I truly believe that groundwork we set from the pre-session through the beginning of the session, throughout that, really helped turn the tide, because there were multiple times where 2140 was probably in real trouble. Just it's the ebbs and flows of the session, where if certain things would have happened at certain times, and then that's when we asked you to apply pressure. We were up there with, working different committee members and different things, and it really kind of swung back in the other direction. And I do want to give credit. You gave credit to Senator Dever, but also credit to Representative McLeod from the Fargo area. She was a champion on this bill specifically as part of it. So great news on that. There is progress on lowering prescription drug costs. Anything else you want to talk about RX?
Just how much people's personal stories really was the other thing that ushered that bill forward. I mean, the more legislators I talked to, they're like, well, yes, my mom or my sister or my aunt. There were so many people that are directly impacted, either themselves being diabetic or someone that they know. And they said, this is a small step, but it could provide significant life-saving, medicine. So I mean, that, if you ever underestimate that, your individual story or your family story doesn't matter. That's, I think, there were two other really strong diabetes advocates that worked on this bill, and they've been working on this bill for several sessions, and they partnered. We were happy to partner with them and really kind of walk side by side. But those stories matter and really push this bill over the edge as well. So
yeah, absolutely. So with that, we're going to jump to the next issue, which is the increasing access to home and community-based services. We know staying safe and independent in your homes is an important issue to you. It shows up every time we do a survey and ask you about it. We hear the anecdotes. I have to go no farther than my own family and have a conversation with some family issues lately about making sure that folks maintain that independence and dignity that we strive for at AARP. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways we do that is support efforts to increase access to home and community-based services. There were really kind of three different buckets that we worked on for this. The first of which, let's just talk about the general services sector. Most of that's found in the Department of Human Services budget and things that people might not otherwise think of, but it's economic assistance programs, it's adult care, older adult care programs, it's meals funding, those types of things. There were significant enhancements to a lot of those efforts in the human services budget this session.
Yeah, you really have to dig deep in the line items of the human services budget. But yeah, the human services budget, you know, they went in knowing that their numbers of calls and referrals to people wanting to stay in their home or coming out of nursing homes or coming out of hospitals, that's where they want to go, is their house. And so they knew they had to invest a significant amount of money to make sure they have fuel assistance, make sure they have, food assistance, making sure that you have staff that are, able to go out and provide those services in community. And, we know that nursing homes are such a, they are a necessary component to the system of care, but we know that that's kind of shifting. COVID really shifted the way that our state was thinking about long-term care. And I think it'll always be a necessity, but I think just by demonstrating the calls have gone up by, they've tripled in some areas. They knew they needed to find money to help people stay in their homes. And this is where they do it, in supporting caregivers, because so many people stay in their homes because of family members that provide that care. And so some of these fuel assistance and the food assistance programs, really, if you look at the whole picture, you need all those pieces to make sure that someone can stay there and be safe.
And this also goes to show in this area, there's also enhancements to senior meal programs through, local senior centers. Part of it, there were some significant enhancements. I know not exactly what those entities wanted, but we had weighed in support of those too, so that those are super helpful. I'm going to pivot just away from that, because kind of the second area then is just housing in general. If folks are in a Victorian style house, steps upwards to the bedroom, steps downstairs to the laundry room, no restroom on the main floor, that's great. And for folks who can live in those for as long as they can safely do so, they should continue to do so. But a lot of times when you're aging, you might need things more on one level and more accessible for mobility issues that might arise or whatnot. And so there were some additional dollars about enhancements to affordable housing.
And that's, again, tucked away in the Industrial Commission budget, but the North Dakota Housing Finance Agency administers the Housing Incentive Fund, or HIF as it's called. And people often ask me, AARP gets involved in housing? Now, how is that an issue? That's something that you all weigh into. But, NDSU just did a study, a needs assessment on housing in the future. And the population 65 and older is really growing tremendously. And what we're seeing is there's not enough housing stock to address the needs of things that people need and want as they age. So, I think the state housing agency had asked for $25 million in the Housing Incentive Fund. Ultimately, they made some adjustments to those numbers, but we ended up with $13.75 million. That money is going to go out the door almost immediately.
The minute it becomes available.
And what it does is it helps build more affordable, and this was new, you can do both single family and multifamily housing. So we're looking at, a one size doesn't always fit everyone, especially in rural and urban communities, but we know there'll be more affordable housing units coming online in the near future because of that funding that was put forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last issue under this kind of bucket of access to home and community-based services is an issue we've worked on for a long time. I remember when we got the first expansion of this program, I think it was 3 or 4, maybe 5 sessions, it might have been 3 or 4 sessions ago, but that it hadn't been expanded since it had been founded. That's the homestead property tax credit program. There was an additional expansion again. This one, without getting into too many details, multiple bills on this.
Mhm.
This ultimately got rolled into that final tax package that you've probably read about or heard about or seen about. We're not going to describe the whole tax package. In part because I don't know that we fully understand the whole tax package, but the part we care about in the tax package is the expansion of the homestead property tax credit. So talk a little bit about what that enhancement looks like and what it means.
Yeah, what it means is there's over $53 million that'll be available for tax credits for folks 65 and older that are still living in their homes. What we know is that people that live in their homes, own their homes, property taxes continue to go up. And so what this does allow you to do is get a tax credit. And so what it did was expand who's eligible for it, and it expanded how much the taxable value, and then how much can come back to you as a tax credit. So this was not something that was a hard issue to sell legislators on. By and large, they said, you know what, we hear from our constituents every day about property taxes.
Right.
And this is the one we can really rally folks around to say more people should be eligible for this tax credit. So how can we make sure that's available to them, and then make those adjustments based on, property values continue to go up, more people are staying in their homes, and that tax credit is really such a great tool to keep people in communities. So.
Do you recall, did the asset test change too? Because the asset test had at one time been raised to $500,000, so that would have included the value of the home. Did this touch that?
I'd have to look back at the details. Okay. Yeah, there's some nuances in the final package, because again, it did get rolled up into the, but I know they went from 6 down to 2. So they really kind of narrowed some focus on it. But we'd have to, we'll look for the email, so we'll give you some more details on, and there'll be a lot of education. That was the other thing we heard from legislators, is that do enough North Dakotans know about this program, because they were worried about putting more money into it or expanding the eligibility. But I think you'll see a lot of education in the next few months about this, and making sure folks know that it's available.
Absolutely. So, well, then let's pivot to our last priority area, which is helping prevent consumer fraud and exploitation. This is an area I'm really proud of. It's a fairly new area for us that we have not spent a ton of time doing advocacy work on. We do plenty of community education work. Anyone who knows AARP in North Dakota knows we regularly have programming on fraud prevention, scam awareness. We twice monthly are appearing on local TV stations talking about this as part of it. But there's really this session, I think we proved our ability to be a leader, and thank you to you all for your input on it, and really saw 2 enhancements. The first of one is the first state where AARP has weighed in and been a part of creating a fraud victim restitution fund. Tell folks a little bit about 2325.
Yeah, and it was a bill that Senator Judy Lee really rallied behind, and then she connected us with the Securities Commissioner, Karen Tyler. And this was a history that was before my time here at AARP, but there's been a lot of work that had been done in the past with the Securities Commissioner, and she really said, hey, there's this great model bill, and and again, this is really narrow in focus, but it looks at investment and securities fraud. But what we know is a lot of you are scammed every day. We know that you're often the target of it. You're at the time of your life, you might not have the ability to recoup some of those funds. This was a big step forward. She thought this would be a tool. If I can't find a way, to make people whole, how can we create a fund that allows this? And there's other restitution funds in our state that are eligible for crime victims. And so this was an easy conversation to have with legislators, because they know that older North Dakotans are targets, but it did create this restitution fund. It sets parameters around who's eligible for it. There's it limits how much you're available. And we know by and large it won't make people whole, but it's a significant step forward to, number one, acknowledge that fraud is a crime, and that you're not just being duped or scammed out of money. These criminals are taking, advantage of you. And so this restitution fund is a significant step forward in addressing the issue.
In total, up to the possibility of $1 million that could be awarded out that otherwise would have gone uncompensated for victims of securities or investment fraud. So really looking forward to the implementation of that bill and working on the implementation rules with the North Dakota Securities Office. Again, I was just at a meeting of central state directors and state presidents, and this is one of the things we talked about, and a lot of interest and attention, and excited that North Dakota will be a leader on this and be a part of it. Next one that I want to just touch on briefly, North Dakota set up a new Medicaid fraud unit just recently in the last 5 years. We're seeing the fact that when they set it up, they probably didn't staff it up to where it needed to be, so there were some additional enhancements to the Medicaid fraud unit under the Attorney General's budget.
Yeah, and you could be a victim of your own success, right? And I think that's what they're struggling with, is that they were understaffed. You know, the director of the crime unit, she's also the one that prosecutes the cases.
Yep.
And so what we were starting to see, just because of the number of investigations had gone up, they were starting to prosecute more cases related to Medicaid fraud. Those cases were hitting kind of a bottleneck because you can't be a director and a prosecutor at the same time. And so, not that she wasn't capable of it, she said, we've reached a point that we need more investigators. We need another attorney to help prosecute. And the legislature, again, said this is a good investment. And again, it's a partnership between the federal government and state government. So it wasn't, really difficult to sell them to say, wow, this is a significant issue and we need to put more resources behind it. So.
Continued efforts to push back and crack down against criminals who are perpetrating fraud and scams, especially those targeting older adults as part of it. So with that, let's jump in. That covers our priority areas, but there's a couple things we want to make sure we take time to study. And the first of which is we don't want to leave without saying thank you to you all, because, well, Janelle and I talk about the work that had happened and why we were successful and the things we did. And trust me, Janelle worked her tail off. Our team was very helpful in making sure we did resources. I spent plenty of time up there, but I really think the success is due to the numbers that are on the screen. So talk a little bit about what we saw over the course of the session in terms of outreach and encouragement from our members and volunteers.
Well, and throughout the the session, sending individual emails, you don't really see the impact. And so when you go back and total things at the end of the session, then you truly do see how much impact you did have. So over 1,300 emails, were sent to legislators in that 75-day period. Right. And it was related to all of our 4 issues that we talked about today. Obviously, some of them got a little bit more attention than others, but it was significant. I mean, to have 1,300 emails sent in 75 days is really, really a great test to say, you matter, and legislators hear from you and they want to hear from you. We had over 59 people that came to the day at the Capitol.
It was great to have you all back.
Lots of red shirts in the Capitol. Legislators seemed a little bit confused because they hadn't seen, us at the Capitol. So that was good, and we hope to do that again. And what was really great was we did the legislative blowdowns at the during crossover, the halfway point. And what we heard was people loved being in community again together. So we had somewhat of a hybrid event where we hosted, 4 different communities where people had some lunch, and then you and I were broadcast live in 4 different locations. But what we heard was, policy or advocacy work is important to you, but also being together and discussing issues in the same room is important too. So we thank you for being part of this legislative session. You made a huge impact.
Thank you. We appreciate it so much. So that's it, right? We're done.
Yeah.
We don't even do anything for another 18 months.
I wish.
Psych.
No. Okay.
So what's next?
Yeah. After the dust settles, you know where we stand now. Legislative management meets not next week, but the week after, and so that's when they look at all of the bills or all the resolutions that said these are issues that we think you should study during the interim. And so legislative management will look and go through all that list of bills. They'll decide which ones they'll move forward. They'll assign them to the respective committees. We're not sure exactly what's on that list yet. We're waiting to see that list, but we know that there'll likely be issues that we'll want to study and follow, and we'll make sure that you're aware of those issues and find ways for you to interact with legislators that are on those interim committees.
Yeah, absolutely. In addition, I think it's important to know most of the new policy changes. So, for example, the new Victim Compensation Fund under Senate Bill 2325, that none of those policy changes go into effect until August 1st, unless a certain bill had an emergency clause, which said it had to reach a certain threshold of a vote in each chamber and get signed. So those things would go into effect immediately. But most things happen August 1st as part of it. And stay tuned, because we'll be letting you know when those new things are going to come online as we go forward. And if folks want to know more, they want to stay engaged as this rolls forward, where should they be visiting and looking for that information?
Best place to go is our website, aarp.org/ND advocacy. That's where we kept you up to date during the session. That's where you're going to see, things that are going to happen during the interim. There'll also be some federal work that's going to happen during the interim. So your best place is to go check that out, and that's where you'll find the best resources.
Awesome. So with that, we got one other thing that we want to make sure we tell you about today before we sign off for all things advocacy for the last time. But this will not be the last time you'll see us. However, the rest of my team will be getting involved in the action too. And so one of the things we have found, and we think based on what we're seeing in terms of you all watching, you all sending us different notes about different things, is this format seems to be enjoyable and a good way to share information, to kind of keep you up to date. And just because we won't be having a legislative session doesn't mean we don't have a lot of other things going on. We've got different fraud events coming up in the next couple of weeks. We got other outreach and work we're doing. And so we're not going to be doing this weekly, but we're going to start doing twice a month, starting on May 25th. We're going to be launching all things AARP North Dakota. And we're going to be doing shows on Thursdays. I think it's the second and fourth Thursday. It's on the screen, she says. She's pointing on the screen. I was leaning to say second, fourth Thursday of each month. I believe we're going to do those at 10:30 in the morning, but you'll be able to find them on our YouTube channel as well as our AARP North Dakota Facebook page. I'm sure we'll provide links for other social media places as well. I'm excited. We'll be having on different guests. Some of you that volunteer with us will likely be asking you to come on. If you see us out at events and we ask you to do a quick little interview to help us tell the story about why you're engaging and why others should engage with us, we invite you to do that, because we'll probably use those as part of those events well. But I'm really excited. I missed not doing this for a week last week. I really did. It's just kind of become a routine and a habit. And so we're excited to test it out for the rest of the year and see how it goes. And if it's helpful to you all, please let us know. And if it's not, tell us that too, so we can adapt and whatnot. So until next session, when we come back with all things all things advocacy, anything else you want to talk about or say regarding the session?
I think Marty should put together, like some of our greatest hits.
Clips.
Yeah, little clips from our,
Clips
because if you look back, if you've been watching us since January 3rd, you're going to see a very different look from week to week, or from, so it'd be nice to see our outtakes.
We look a lot more refreshed on January 3rd than we do probably today. So
no, it's been a good session. It was a tough session. I think we learned a lot about what you want as our members, and what older North Dakotans want. We learned what legislators, where they stand on issues. Yep. It was a learning curve for a lot of people. New legislators, new legislative management staff, new leadership. So I think over the interim, we'll have opportunities that you can find ways to interact with your legislators. This doesn't just stop because the session is over. I think this is an ongoing conversation that we hope you want to be part of. We've just started on some of these really important areas, and I think that's the biggest takeaway is, although the dust is settled and I'm trying to figure out what I do day to day now, there's still a lot of work to be done, and I really encourage you all to stay involved with us, even though it's not a legislative year. So.
Absolutely. I want to do a couple of quick thank yous before we get out of here, and then we'll close up shop and get out of here and forward to the May 25th, all things AARP North Dakota. I'm very excited about that, by the way. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. First is I want to give a shout out to our now former intern, Haley Volmer. Haley interned with us for over a year. She was a huge help in making this get better each week. She's the one who put together the intro video. So if you like the intro and exit video, that's Haley's work, and super excited. We're proud of Haley. She's got a year left in her collegiate career, and know she's coming back to North Dakota for the summer, and hopefully we'll run into her as part of it. But huge thanks to Haley. The other thank you is she's behind the camera all the time, and every once in a while you'll hear her laugh or smile or whatnot, but it's Marty does a great job of making us look good. She makes sure things get set up. She puts together the banners and does all of the things behind the scenes that, well, Janelle and I have done it on this end. It's made our jobs a lot easier to come plop down in these chairs, get ready, and talk about what's going on. And then last but certainly not least, I want to thank the other members of our staff team, specifically Doreen and Wendy, because to be honest, well, Janelle and I were spending 80% of our time the last 4 months. Janelle probably 95% of her time the last 4 months. Me probably 75 to 80% of the time doing advocacy work. Doreen and Wendy were really making sure we had other things happening, other work that we needed to continue to get done, continue to move forward and stay forward, and very excited to pivot away from the all day, everyday advocacy world to some of the broader community outreach. I'm really excited about the hiking events coming up, the hiking series we launched at the end of this month, the All Things AARP coming up, whatnot. And so just thank you. And then last but not least, I really do want to thank you, those of you who are watching. I mean this, and Janelle told an anecdote, and I just want to share an anecdote. One of my favorite stories from this session is when I walked up to a legislator who we were having a hard time to convince on, I think it was on our fraud issue. And when I had a couple conversations, and when I went up to him the last time, he goes, I started hearing from people back home that this might really be an issue. And I just kind of smiled, and I just said, oh, really? I said, well, that's interesting. And we ultimately got their vote on the bill because of it. It's because you all paid attention and act. And so thank you for what you did. We will be back on May 25th. So until then, this has been another All Things Advocacy with AARP North Dakota.